Silence can be louder than words, and today that silence tells a story no denial can erase. When a leaked email surfaced, it did more than circulate on screens. It stopped conversations mid-sentence, froze press rooms, and sent a visible shock through corridors of power. The document was brief, transactional, and chillingly precise. A dollar figure, a request, an expectation, and suddenly, a carefully constructed public image began to fracture. This moment is not about rumor or partisan noise, it is about documentation. An internal message, never meant for public eyes, revealed a proposed exchange that strikes at the heart of trust. $1.9 million, not as a donation, not as a fee, but as leverage. The language was not speculative, it was procedural. That is why reactions were immediate and why the response was hesitation rather than explanation. What followed was not outrage, but paralysis. Cameras waited, questions stacked up, statements were delayed. When leaders freeze, it is rarely because they lack words. It is because the truth has arrived before the script. In public life, confidence thrives on control of narrative. A leak removes that control entirely. This exposure matters beyond the individual moment because it reveals how power can quietly corrode when oversight is treated as optional. Bribery is not just a crime of money. It is a crime against fairness. It tells citizens that access is purchasable and that justice bends for those who can afford the right number. Once that belief takes hold, institutions lose legitimacy faster than any election can restore it. The most disturbing aspect is not the amount, but the casual nature of the exchange. Corruption is most dangerous when it becomes routine, when it is discussed like scheduling, approved like an invoice, and hidden behind professional language. That normalization is how systems fail without collapsing, how wrongdoing survives in plain sight. This moment now forces a choice. Ignore the evidence and confirm the public's worst fears, or confront it directly and accept the consequences. Accountability is not measured by statements of innocence, but by transparency, cooperation, and the willingness to submit to scrutiny without conditions. History shows that scandals are rarely remembered for the acts themselves, but for how leaders respond when exposed. This is one of those moments. The email exists. The amount is known. The silence has been noted. What comes next will define whether this episode becomes a footnote or a turning point. Because when truth leaks out, it does not ask permission. It only waits to see who will answer for it. The leaked email stands at the center of this moment because it removes ambiguity and replaces speculation with documentation. In public controversies, uncertainty is often the shield behind which those in power take cover. Allegations can be dismissed as politically motivated, rumors can be labeled as misinformation, and critics can be accused of exaggeration. A written record, however, changes the terrain completely. An internal message is not an opinion or an interpretation. It is a snapshot of intent, captured before anyone thought they would have to explain it. What makes this email so powerful is not only its existence, but its tone and structure. It does not read like confusion or misunderstanding. It reads like process. There is a clarity to the language that suggests familiarity, as if such exchanges are not extraordinary but part of an established pattern. This is why the document carries such weight. It reveals how decisions may be discussed behind closed doors when there is no expectation of public accountability. In doing so, it exposes a gap between what is promised publicly and what may be practiced privately. The speech underscores that once evidence appears in this form, control over the narrative is lost. Spin relies on uncertainty. Damage control relies on plausible doubt. A leaked email collapses both. Every word becomes fixed, every number becomes verifiable, and every omission becomes suspicious. The conversation is no longer about what might have happened, but about why it was written, who authorized it, and who benefited from it. These are questions that cannot be answered with broad statements or emotional appeals. Equally important is the way documentation shifts the burden of proof. Instead of critics having to prove wrongdoing, those implicated must now explain the evidence away. That reversal is destabilizing, especially for institutions accustomed to operating from positions of authority. The speech highlights how this sudden shift produces visible paralysis. Silence follows, not because there is nothing to say, but because anything said must now contend with a concrete record that contradicts easy denials. The leaked email also resonates because it reflects a wider public frustration with secrecy. People increasingly distrust closed systems where decisions affecting millions are made without visibility. When a document like this surfaces, it confirms long-held suspicions that power often operates by different rules behind the scenes. scenes. That recognition fuels public anger far more effectively than any speech or protest because it feels personal and validating. Ultimately, the email is framed not as an isolated artifact but as a symbol of exposure. It represents the moment when private assumptions collide with public scrutiny. Once that collision occurs, there is no return to normalcy. Evidence does not fade with the news cycle. It lingers, referenced again and again, shaping every subsequent response. In that sense, the leaked email is not merely a trigger for controversy. It is the foundation upon which all accountability must now be built. The moment silence takes over in the aftermath of exposure, it becomes a statement in itself. In situations where leaders are accustomed to commanding attention, shaping debate, and responding rapidly to even minor criticism, hesitation stands out sharply. The speech frames this pause not as a neutral gap, but as a visible fracture, an instant where authority falters under the weight of evidence. When questions are clear and the response is delayed, observers naturally begin to ask why. Silence in public life is rarely accidental. Communications teams exist precisely to prevent it, to ensure that explanations, denials, or reframings are ready at a moment's notice. When those mechanisms fail to activate, it suggests internal conflict or uncertainty. The speech highlights this paralysis as a critical signal. It indicates that the usual tools of damage control are ineffective against what has emerged. In such moments, silence is not strategic restraint. It is an admission that the situation cannot be easily managed. The freezing response also alters perception. Confidence depends on immediacy. Even a flawed explanation can preserve authority if delivered decisively. Delay, however, invites interpretation. Every passing hour allows narratives to solidify without official input, and those narratives are rarely generous. The speech emphasizes that public trust erodes fastest not when leaders speak and are challenged, but when they withdraw and leave questions unanswered. In the absence of clarity, suspicion fills the void. This hesitation is particularly telling because it contrasts sharply with past behavior. Leaders who routinely respond forcefully to critics, dismiss investigations, or project certainty suddenly appear cautious and restrained. That contrast amplifies the sense that something is wrong. The speech uses this shift to underline a broader truth. Inconsistency in response often reveals the severity of the threat. When routine defenses are abandoned, it signals that the stakes are unusually high. Silence also changes power dynamics. Normally, authority dictates the pace of discussion. By freezing, that control is surrendered. Journalists, analysts, and the public take the lead, dissecting documents, timelines, and implications. Each unanswered question becomes a prompt for deeper scrutiny. The speech suggests that this loss of narrative control is one of the most damaging consequences of hesitation because it cannot be reversed once momentum shifts. There is also a psychological dimension. Silence communicates fear more clearly than words ever could. It suggests that those involved are calculating risk, weighing consequences, and searching for a response that may not exist. The speech frames this as a moment of exposure, where the composed exterior gives way to visible vulnerability. For the public, that vulnerability confirms that the issue is not trivial. Ultimately, the freezing response is portrayed as a mirror held up to the gravity of the situation. It tells observers that the problem is not merely inconvenient, but potentially devastating. Silence becomes evidence, not of innocence, but of crisis. And once that impression takes hold, every subsequent statement is filtered through it. What might have been dismissed early now demands explanation, precisely because nothing was said when it mattered most. The speech deliberately reframes the issue away from an isolated incident and toward a structural threat, arguing that bribery is not merely a personal failing, but a danger to the entire system of governance. When corruption is treated as an individual scandal, it can be contained, personalized, and eventually forgotten. Responsibility is narrowed, consequences are negotiated, and institutions emerge largely untouched. The speech challenges this pattern by emphasizing that bribery distorts the rules for everyone, not just those directly involved. At its core, bribery undermines the principle of equal access. In a functioning system, decisions are meant to be guided by law, merit, and public interest. When money enters the equation as leverage, those principles are replaced by privilege. The speech stresses that this shift is corrosive because it sends a clear message. Outcomes are not determined by fairness but by financial influence. Once that belief spreads, public faith in institutions begins to erode, even among those who are not directly affected. The danger is amplified because corruption rarely operates in isolation. One successful illicit exchange sets a precedent, signaling to others that the system is permeable. The speech presents bribery bribery as contagious, encouraging a culture where unethical behavior is rewarded rather than punished. Over time, this creates a parallel system of power, one that exists beneath formal structures but often overrides them. Laws remain on the books, but enforcement becomes selective, shaped by access and money rather than justice. Another critical point is that systemic corruption weakens accountability mechanisms themselves. Oversight bodies, investigative processes, and ethical safeguards rely on institutional integrity to function. When bribery infiltrates these systems, it compromises their ability to respond effectively. The speech suggests that this is why exposure is so destabilizing. It threatens not just reputations, but the credibility of the structures meant to prevent such behavior in the first place. The broader social impact is equally significant. Ordinary citizens, observing repeated scandals with limited consequences, begin to disengage. Participation declines, cynicism rises, and trust becomes fragile. The speech frames this disengagement as one of the most damaging outcomes of systemic corruption. A society that no longer believes in fair process is more vulnerable to instability, polarization, and manipulation. Bribery, in this sense, is not just theft. It is a slow extraction of confidence from the public sphere. By shifting focus from the individual act to its systemic implications, the speech calls attention to what is truly at stake. It argues that the real harm is not confined to a single transaction, but lies in the precedent it sets and the normalization it encourages. When corruption is minimized as a personal lapse, the system survives unchanged. When it is recognized as a structural threat, reform becomes unavoidable. That recognition is what gives the moment its significance and why the issue cannot be dismissed as just another scandal. The speech identifies normalization as the most dangerous phase of corruption because it marks the point at which wrongdoing stops feeling like a violation and starts feeling like routine. When unethical behavior is shocking, it still has the power to provoke resistance. When it becomes ordinary, it quietly reshapes expectations. The speech argues that this shift is far more damaging than any single act because it changes how decisions are made, justified, and repeated over time. What makes normalization so insidious is its subtlety. Corruption rarely announces itself with dramatic language or obvious threats. Instead, it adopts the tone of professionalism. Transactions are framed as arrangements, favors are called understandings, and illicit exchanges are hidden behind administrative wording. The speech emphasizes that when bribery is discussed in calm procedural terms, it signals familiarity. It suggests that those involved are not acting out of desperation, but out of habit. That habit is what allows corruption to persist without constant concealment. The danger deepens when systems adapt around unethical practices rather than resisting them. Processes begin to accommodate shortcuts, exceptions, and informal channels. People learn which rules can be bent, which procedures can be bypassed, and which outcomes can be purchased. The speech frames this adaptation as a form of institutional decay. The structure remains intact on the surface, but its internal logic has changed. Decisions no longer flow from principle, but from convenience and leverage. Normalization also alters moral perception. When unethical actions are repeated without consequence, they stop registering as wrong. Those involved begin to see themselves not as violators, but as realists navigating a flawed system. The speech suggests that this self-justification is one of corruption's most effective defenses. Once people believe this is how things work, resistance feels naive rather than necessary. That mindset spreads quickly, especially in environments where success appears to depend on participation. Another critical aspect is how normalization discourages whistleblowing and dissent. When corruption is widespread, speaking out becomes risky and isolating. The speech implies that individuals who might otherwise object choose silence, believing their objections will change nothing or cost them everything. Over time, silence becomes complicity, not because people agree, but because they adapt. This collective adaptation creates the illusion of consensus, reinforcing the cycle. The speech also points out that normalized corruption is harder to dismantle than isolated misconduct. Punishing a single act does little when the underlying behavior is embedded in routine operations. Reforms fail if they address symptoms rather than culture. This is why exposure is so threatening. It interrupts normalization. It forces what has been quietly accepted back into public view, where it must be judged against stated values rather than internal customs. Ultimately, the speech warns that the greatest risk is not that corruption exists, but that it becomes invisible through familiarity. When unethical behavior blends seamlessly into everyday procedure, it stops triggering alarm. That is the point at which institutions no longer correct themselves, because they no longer recognize the need to. Normalization, not outrage, is where systems quietly cross the line from flawed to compromised. The The speech frames accountability as the decisive factor that determines how moments of exposure are remembered, judged, and ultimately recorded. History, it argues, is not kind to evasiveness. Public figures may survive allegations, denials, and even temporary outrage, but they are defined by how they respond when evidence removes ambiguity. Accountability, in this sense, is not a moral abstraction. It is a practical test of credibility under pressure. What distinguishes accountability from mere reaction is willingness. The speech stresses that true accountability is voluntary before it is enforced. It is demonstrated through openness, cooperation, and a readiness to submit to scrutiny without conditions or delay. This distinction matters because forced compliance often appears defensive, while voluntary transparency signals recognition of responsibility. Observers are acutely sensitive to this difference, and it shapes whether a response is perceived as corrective or self-protective. The speech also highlights that accountability is cumulative. A single statement cannot resolve a crisis if it is contradicted by subsequent behavior. Consistency becomes critical. Cooperation with investigations, respect for oversight, and acceptance of outcomes all contribute to how the episode is judged over time. The absence of these elements does more damage than the original allegation because it suggests that preservation of power is valued above integrity. Another key element is consequence. The speech makes clear that accountability without consequence is symbolic at best. Apologies that lead nowhere, inquiries that stall, and reforms that remain rhetorical fail to restore trust. Consequences demonstrate that rules apply uniformly and that no position grants immunity. Without them, accountability becomes performance rather than principle, reinforcing cynicism rather than alleviating it. The speech further argues that moments like this extend beyond individual legacy and into institutional memory. How leadership responds sets a precedent that others will follow. If accountability is embraced, it strengthens norms and deters future misconduct. If it is resisted, it signals that exposure can be survived without meaningful change. That signal can shape behavior for years, quietly influencing how power is exercised behind closed doors. Public judgment, the speech suggests, is rarely immediate. Initial reactions may be emotional, divided, or uncertain. Over time, however, patterns emerge. People remember who confronted the issue directly and who attempted to outlast it. Accountability becomes the lens through which the entire episode is reinterpreted. Evidence that once seemed explosive becomes secondary to the question of response. Ultimately, the speech presents accountability as the point where control ends and credibility begins. It is uncomfortable, risky, and often costly, but it is also the only path that alters historical judgment. Attempts to minimize, delay, or deflect may succeed briefly, but they fail in the long arc of public memory. In that arc, what matters is not perfection, but responsibility. How this moment is answered will decide whether it is remembered as an act of exposure followed by correction, or as a warning ignored when it mattered most.